The story of the widow in 2 Kings 4 is one of the most butchered scriptures about money ever. So I'm here to set the record straight and to give you some financial tools to help your family not just survive, but to thrive.
1, 2, 3, 4.
This is StewardShift, a show that gives you the tools you need to get the most of your best resources. Your money, your mind, your body, your time.
Welcome back to the StewardShift Show. My name is Troy Solomon Levy, and I am your host. Debt in America is at an all-time high. It has now hit in 2025, $18.2 trillion. That's trillion with a T, not with an M, not with a B, but trillion with a T. At the same time, in a 2025 American Dream study created by the financial literacy firm Investopedia, they found, this is what their research found, that being debt-free is one of Americans' highest ideals, one of Americans' highest desires. And so if that's our desire, but yet we have $18.2 trillion of debt, something is missing here. There's a missing link between what our ideal is and what the reality is looking like. So I want to share with you just this story in 2 Kings 4 that will definitely help you on your journey as you seek to get rid of some debt. And this is going to help you spiritually as well as financially. So in verse 1, it says that this widow comes to the prophet Elisha and she has this complaint. She has this concern. She's very worried. She has a lot of anxiety. She says that, of course, her husband is dead and the husband had some debt. And the creditor, the person that the husband owed, has now knocked on her door expecting to take her sons as slaves in order to pay the debt. This is a scary moment because if you didn't know, in the ancient Near East, which is the time and the place where this story took place, it's very different than where I live in America. Widows, people who are vulnerable, they were very much dependent on others for their survival. There was no social financial system. There was no safety net like we might have in America. They had nothing. And so if they didn't have a husband to depend on or their father to depend on, then life could very well get very, very tough. So this woman who has lost her husband, he had some debt. That was a tough situation. And now, if you know anything about debt, they're going to get their money one way or the other. And we'll be back there in just a second. But the biblical reality is that debt is not something that God has as an ideal for anyone that believes in him, for anyone that serves him. Here's why I say that. Proverbs 22, verse 7, this is coming from the wisest man who has ever lived. His name is Solomon. It says that the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a slave to the lender. Now, these are just some observations. Solomon isn't saying what should be or what God intended or anything like that, but these are just observations in the world in which we live. And it's not just true for back then, it's true for today. Rich people, generally speaking, do rule over the poor. They get a lot more benefits and that's just reality. And also, those who borrow, we are definitely slaves to the lender. Lenders are in a position of authority. They're in a position where they can control. And if we're borrowing, then we're definitely slaves to the lender. And the widow's experiencing this with her two sons. They're about to be sold into slavery. And this is the last thing that this widow wants for her sons. Now, this is probably also the last thing that her deceased husband could have ever imagined. But here's the thing. Life happens. Sometimes death happens. The worst imaginable things always happen to us. We don't know when they'll happen, but we know that emergencies will come up. And sometimes the worst things happen at the worst possible time. And this is actually a great reason to avoid debt as much as we possibly can. When we go into debt, our future is now tied up in paying somebody back. When we go into debt, we're living a reactive life instead of living life proactively. That means that we buy something now and pay for it later. But when you live life proactively, you save for it now and then you get that thing later. Now, we don't know the nature of the debt. We don't know the situation in that family. So we're not here judging that family at all. This is just what debt does. But nonetheless, This widow has a very serious problem because if her sons get sold into slavery, first of all, that's just a bad situation for both of them. She'll be really, really sad, but she'll also not have anyone to help support her in a society that was very much dominated by men. She needs her sons for more reasons than one. So Elisha definitely understands how dire the situation is, and he asks her the question, what can I do to help you? And he asks her, tell me, what do you have in your house? She answers, I don't have anything. Elisha's probably scratching his chin like, nothing? Like, you don't have a table, you don't have a bed, you have nothing at all? And she's like, okay, well, I have nothing except for this small flask of olive oil. And Elisha's like, hey, that's perfect. You have something and we're going to use it. What this tells us is that all of us have something. And at some points, we might have to get creative in order to not just survive, but to thrive. So just because a woman didn't have a dollar, just because she didn't have any cash on hand, that doesn't mean that she didn't have anything. She definitely had something, no matter how small it might have been. And guess what? You have something also. All of us have skills. We all have an education. We all have experiences and maybe passions that can be used. You might have a car that can be used, maybe Ubering around or being a chauffeur. You might have a home that can be put on the market or can be rented out. You might have some money that maybe isn't being used as wisely for the purposes that you could possibly use it for. And if you don't have any of those things that I just listed to you, hey, most people watching probably do have their two hands. You have some ideas. You have something that can be used in order to get your family not just to survive, but to thrive. And that's exactly where God starts. God starts with the little bit that we have in our hands. And when we put what we have, even if it's just a little bit, into the hands of God, then he starts multiplying whatever little we have into creating something much. So when Elisha finds out that this widow does in fact have something, she has this small flask of olive oil. And then here are the further instructions from Elisha. He tells her, borrow as many empty jars as you can from your friends and your neighbors. Now, here's where the interpretation of this story starts to get off track. Some people say that because Elisha tells her to go borrow some jars from her neighbors, that they now suggest that, hey, go into debt or use debt as leverage in order to get even greater things. You can invest the debt, the stuff that you borrow, the money that you borrow, in order to invest it and get a greater return on those investments that might be greater than the interest rate on the debt. Now, here's where things are definitely different and why this is not good advice. Firstly, borrowing from your neighbor is a lot different than borrowing from a financial institution. So borrowing a jar from your neighbor is not the same as borrowing money from the bank. Now, because this widow lived in a very community-oriented culture, such as the ancient Near East was, borrowing a jar from a neighbor was a lot like borrowing some sugar from a neighbor. You're not really expected, just in the neighborly aspect of things, to give the sugar back. If you're borrowing some sugar, hey, a good neighbor would say, just take the sugar. It's okay. You don't have to pay that back. Now, maybe a jar might be a little bit more expensive, and maybe your neighbor might expect a jar back, which is fine. But that's still a lot different than paying back money that's owed to a financial institution. When you borrow something from your neighbor, that's a relational thing. When you borrow something from a bank, that's very much transactional. So Elisha is not telling this woman to go even deeper into debt in order to pay the debts off. Firstly, that just doesn't make sense. Secondly, look, that's just not what the Bible is saying. What the Bible is saying is that your community has something. And when you're in need, don't be afraid to tap into your circle for support. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't be afraid to ask for help. 9 out of 10 people that you know, whether they're your friends or your neighbors, are probably willing to help. And many of us don't ask because we're always thinking about the 1 person out of 10 that might say no. Don't worry about that 1 person out of 10. Tap into your community, tap into your social circles. Most people want to see you succeed. So after she finished gathering all those jars from her friends, from her neighbors, Elisha tells her to go into the house with her sons and to shut the door behind them. They began to pour that oil into the jars that they had borrowed from their neighbors. And guess what? That small flask of oil kept multiplying and kept multiplying, and it did not run empty. And They replaced one full jar with another empty jar, and they moved that one out the way and put another empty jar there until all the jars were done. And it wasn't until all the jars that she had borrowed from her neighbors were full that the oil began to run out. And the last set of instructions that Elisha tells her is to go and sell that oil. And you were able to pay off your debts with that oil. And not only was she able to pay off her debts with the oil, but she had a good amount left over for her and her sons to live on. They didn't just survive, but they thrived. Now, here's one of the most important lessons that this story could ever teach us, and that's to find a gap in our community somewhere and serve that need. That could be a product, that can be a service, but find a gap where maybe someone isn't serving, or maybe even if someone is serving or filling that need, that there's a lot more where that came from. People still have a need for that. So that can be washing someone's car. That can be, there could be a doctor, a need for a doctor in your community, or a dog walker, or a veterinarian, or an accountant, or a nurse, or it could be something. Does someone need their car washed? Like, what are the needs in your community, in your circle? And look to fill that gap, because that gap is a perfect place to start, so that you can create more margin for yourself, increase what you're bringing in so that you could pay off your debts. Now, here's a very interesting thing that the Bible teaches us, is that the widow's neighbors had empty vessels for a reason. Here's the reason. They didn't have any oil either. I mean, you have all of these empty jars just kind of sitting around that were designed to hold oil, but none of them had oil in them. And she saw that need. She saw that gap in her community, and she decided to fill that gap. Now, God did work this thing miraculously, but God didn't work until she started working. The miracle wasn't God giving her cash. God gave her an idea. God gave her the empty vessels because, hey, her neighbors needed some oil, and because they had a need, God put on her heart to serve that need. And the miracle, the real miracle, was that God worked as she worked. So don't underestimate what God can do with just a little bit. In God's hands, your little bit definitely can become a lot. God doesn't want you to just survive. God wants you to thrive. And that, my friends, is what financial freedom looks like.